at the Hollywood Fringe, as well as the Edinburgh Fringe, which is where I do a lot of my productions over the last 20 years. So I think the best thing to do would just be to have the panelists introduce themselves and give us, however brief or expansive a synopsis of their experience as musical producers as they feel is needed, and just go in alphabetical order. And that would start with Spencer, Mr. Frankeberger.
Alphabetical, my last name. I see. What a twist.
Yes.
So I'm Spencer. I have produced, this year will be my 4th year producing a musical at Hollywood Fringe. And every year I've learned something different. The first year, there's an airplane flying over me. I don't know if you hear it or not.
Nope.
My first year I wrote and composed and produced my musical. The next year I did the same thing. The last year I had a composing team because I learned that producing is very important and not just doing everything. And this year it's a collaborative effort for my new show. But along the way I learned a lot of new things, and I've won awards for one of my show. And yeah, this will be my 4th year at Fringe, so I'm excited about it.
Excellent. And by the way, I mean, just very, very briefly, I'm assuming most, if not all of you, have either already participated in the Fringe or have researched it enough that some of what I'm about to say, you already know. But very briefly, the Fringe is it's an open festival, like many of them are, and basically you need to associate yourself with a venue, and then once a venue gives you a deal, makes an offer that you accept in terms of the number of dates and the times and which space, etc. Then you're in the festival. I mean, you can pre-register with the Fringe without a venue, but you can't ultimately participate in the festival, of course, without a deal in place with the venues. Essentially, what most people do is they kind of pre-register and they upload their show details, and then they either already have a relationship with the venue that they know how to go directly with them. Spencer, have you done all yours at Studio C, or you're at the complex? Where you've been all over?
So 2017, I did Underground Annex, and then 2019 was Studio C, and this year I'm still talking to Matt Quinn about to put it up, but most likely it would be Studio C.
Yeah, Matt Quinn is one of the biggest players at the festival in the sense that he runs a company called Theater Asylum, who book, or what we in the Edinburgh world we would call him a promoter. He is the person that actually books the venues, and Theater Asylum handles several venues, including a couple of the ones that Spencer just mentioned. Noel, over to you.
Hi. Yes. So I've been writing musicals since I was very young, and the first musical that I wrote that I got to see was in college. And the college I went to didn't have a musical theater program, department, or anything. The only thing they had was a Gilbert and Sullivan Club. So I went to the Gilbert and Sullivan Club and I said, I would like you to do an original musical that I will write. And they said, we only do Gilbert and Sullivan. And I said, okay, I will write it in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan. So that meant that I had a Gilbert and Sullivan style show. Then, let's say 20 years pass, or 15 years pass, and a woman who had been in one of my shows was now a grad student in Edinburgh and working with the Gilbert and Sullivan group at the University of Edinburgh, and they were doing a show every summer in the festival. And so, thanks to her, I got my musical in the 50th Edinburgh Festival, and it was such a success that they did it again and again. That's 2 again. So that's, I think, a total of 3 times in the Edinburgh Festival. I also had a show in the New York Musical Festival that won a lot of awards. And then last fall, I got a call from a very talented actor named Stephen Traska. And Stephen said, I'm thinking of doing a one-man show. Would you like to write some songs for it? And I said, sure. And basically, we turned that into a one-man musical that he booked into this year's Hollywood Fringe. So this will be my first experience with the Hollywood Fringe. And the one thing I said to him was, You know, any month is good for me except June because I'm already contracted to do another musical with a cast of 30 people in June in a different theater. When is your show going up? And he said June, and I said, okay.
Which venue were you in, or are you going to be in? Let's hope.
Oh, I wish I had this information memorized.
That's all right. Yeah,
Is there an
understood.
actor's coop? I know it's near the Formosa Cafe at
Yes,
like,
the actors co-op back there, I think, is one of the spaces that the books. Yeah, they're basically down Formosa Avenue off of
yes,
Santa
that must
Monica.
be it
Yeah.
because I remember the location, not the name, and you're confirming for me.
Yeah, I think it might be Actors Company or somebody. I know the theaters. There's like two or three small little spaces. Well, they're all relatively small, aren't they?
Yes.
Um, and what was your last year in Edinburgh? Because I started there in 2001.
Ah, okay. The first year in Edinburgh was 1996. I don't know. I can't remember what year were the subsequent years because I only traveled over there for the first one.
Right.
So it's like when they're doing a show halfway across the world and you wrote it, you don't really memorize the date because you're not there to see it or to remember traveling there. But the name
Yeah.
of the show is Murder at the Savoy.
Yeah, I think they might have. I think that the third. It sounds familiar. So, anyway, Michael, Mr. Shapiro.
I'm going to steal an idea from my colleagues and use the Fringe as a chronological organizational scheme for describing my background, because it's
Okay.
kind of a handy way to approach it. So the most immediately lucrative part of my creative life is writing music for film and TV and video games. If I didn't love that so much, I would call that my day job. But in the early 2000s, I started taking musical theater more seriously with the intent of adding that as a branch of what I do. So my first involvement with the Hollywood Fringe was the result of answering a Craigslist ad. A guy named Gregory Crafts put out an ad saying, I've got a kid's show, I need a composer. And we had lunch at Denny's and hit it off. And fast forward a few years to the 2011 Hollywood Fringe, where we brought Super Sidekick, the musical, to that festival. So that was my Hollywood Fringe debut. And that show did pretty well. It went on to the New York Fringe and then was eventually picked up for publication by Samuel French, in whose good hands it remains today. So that was a nice way to kick things off. In parallel to that, I was writing a lot of short 10 to 15 minute musicals and putting them in festivals and sometimes producing them myself. And this was a way to fail without consequences. Because if you write a 10-minute musical and it's terrible, it's a great learning experience and you're only traumatized for a few days, as opposed to writing a full length and having the same experience. So that was the self-tutelage part of my career in musical theater. And that culminated with my realizing you can take a bunch of short musicals and kind of glom them together and get a free full-length anthology. So I returned to the Hollywood Fringe in 2016 with the anthology of some of my short musicals. And the production was called A Feast of Snacks. And that was produced by Theater Unleashed. And that was a very good experience as well. Fast forward to last year at the 2019 Hollywood Fringe, I brought my first full-length single author musical to the Hollywood Fringe of that year. And that was called The Bully Problem. And it was a family-friendly show combining science fiction and making a statement. It was more pro-nerd than anti-bullying, but it was clearly an anti-bullying message. And that was the result of a long collaborative relationship with New Musicals, Inc., which is the organization sponsoring this event. I started with them as a student in their main educational program and eventually evolved into developing 2 shows on a one-on-one basis. And after a few years, it was clear they couldn't get rid of me, so they co-produced The Bully Problem with me. And looking into the optimistic future, if all goes well, NMI and I will be bringing my next family-friendly musical to the Fringe in October, fingers crossed. And that show is called Gideon and the BLUNDERSNORP. And as the name suggests, it's kind of a medievalish fantasy, also very family-friendly, which is kind of the channels I found myself running. So that's probably as succinct a self-synopsis as I can get.
And that's slated for October. I mean, if the festival does go forward as postponed,
Exactly.
that would be at the Broadwater.
It is. If there's a Hollywood Fringe in October, we'll be there at the Broadwater main stage with Gideon and the BLUNDERSNORP.
Yeah, against many of you may already know this. The Broadwater is a space with, I think, 4 theaters. They've got the main stage, the Black, second stage, and a studio, I think, run by the Sacred Fools Theater Company. So them, along with the Complex and Theater Asylum, they're one of the top promoters, bookers, venue providers, if you will, at the Hollywood Fringe. I know, I think, all of you maybe, or certainly Noel and Michael have mentioned the New York Fringe. I produced a musical there called Bucalcical that won the New York Fringe a few years back. That was my only experience there. It took a hiatus, but I think they're back on now, right? I think the New York Fringe is no.
They died permanently.
Oh, they're done.
And they died before the pandemic. I think January they announced, that's it, we're done.
Oh, I didn't even know that. I probably got distracted. I knew they took some time off. Well, so that option is no longer there. I mean, the Hollywood Fringe has certainly become a player in the fringe circuit. Edinburgh, of course, is the grandfather or grandmother of them all. And there are other festivals internationally besides Edinburgh. I would say in the United States, the Orlando Fringe, the Hollywood Fringe, there's a ton of them in the United States. I think Orlando is probably as prominent. I'm not sure it's even as big as the Hollywood Fringe anymore, but it's certainly one of the major ones. The Hollywood Fringe, look, we're supposed to be told August 1st, whether it's going to go forward in October. I've had so many calls, as I'm sure all of you have, with respect to whether it's going to go forward as planned. And I guess there's so many factors. I mean, the so-called reopening of our society remains to be seen. Are people going to go and sit in a theater with masks on and 2 seats apart or 1 seat apart from the other patrons? Are they going to want to gather on Santa Monica Boulevard in front of Studio C or the Complex or the Fringe Central where there's 100 people on the sidewalk at the height of a particular Friday night or something? I don't know. I don't know if people are going to come out. This is assuming the festival is going forward, which I'm optimistically thinking that by October it hopefully will. But will we get the audience? I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts about that prospect? Anybody?
I'll be there. I'll show up to other people's shows.
I'm sorry?
I'll show up to other people's shows, so that's at least 1 ticket right there.
Yeah, I guess that's what we're all hoping. Edinburgh was postponed for a year. Well, not postponed; it was canceled for 2020, and so it is going to resume in 2021. And the venues, basically, what they did is they said if you had a slot for 2020 and you let them keep your deposit, they would hold the slot. And I guess the Hollywood Fringe is sort of approached it the same way in terms of postponement, right? That if you already had a slot booked at Studio C or Broadwater or whatever, you're going to have that same set of dates and time slots as you would have done had we gone forward in June. Again, just briefly explain, I mean, most of you may already know this, but unlike Edinburgh, which is the same day, same performance time every day, and you perform every day of August. The Hollywood Fringe, typically people, you can book as many dates as the venue will book for you. I think 5 to 7 seems to sort of be the sweet spot, maybe trending more towards the 5 dates over the month of June. And while the venue is generally the same, although not necessarily, the very first show I produced there, we split the venue. So in the first couple of performances were at the Lounge on Santa Monica Boulevard, and then a couple more were at Theater of Note over on Cahuenga. But I don't recommend that, by the way. So usually the venue is the same, but the dates are like Monday at 7 p.m., Saturday at 11 a.m., whatever you can negotiate with your venue. Whatever those dates and times were for June, as far as I know, the venues are honoring those for October as well.
Yeah, Mike, I'll jump in and say that I know for the Broadwater, we are reserved there not only for getting the BLUNDERSNORP, but for a couple of other things, and they sort of mirrored all of our dates and moved them to October, with the caveat that a decision will be made by August 1st as to whether it's happening at all or not.
Right. Well, actually, that's an excellent point, because the calendar of June doesn't duplicate the calendar of October, obviously, including the number of days in the month.
Well, you're duplicating it by the week, right? So if
yeah, exactly. So
whatever the same, yeah, right. The same day and week of the time that coordinates with the first 3 weeks of October that coordinate with the first 3 weeks of June.
Yes. So if you had the first Thursday in June at 7 p.m., you are generally speaking going to have the first Thursday in October at 7 p.m. in the same venue. But why don't we talk a little bit about, is there anything that you found unique about writing and developing, I have that backwards, developing and writing, producing a musical for Fringe generally, or Hollywood Fringe in particular? And Spencer, you've sort of focused, as far as I understand it, on the Hollywood Fringe. Can you speak to what are these specific or unique challenges with respect to that?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things I learned with not so much necessarily the writing process, but as far as the producing and writing, I usually write my shows like 3 weeks before the preview, because I just run out of time because I'm producing everything. I've learned to kind of start it a little bit earlier, and then the producing element kind of adds on after the writing process, or throughout the writing process. But what I've really noticed specifically with Hollywood Fringe, which is the one I've done, is finding a way to sell seats. And I've learned it's a matter of talking to people and being really excited about your project, but also going to other people's shows and supporting. I've learned is the best way to get butts in seats. Saying, as someone who filled about 50% of the house 2017, 75% in 2018, and sold out my entire run and added a show last year, that I was like, oh, it's a lot of literally talking to people and being engaged by your show. And I luckily have learned throughout the years to have, like last year I had a composer, so I wasn't writing it all myself. This year I'm co-composing and co-writing with someone. So I'm splitting the work, and it actually adds better ideas, which is what I've learned is me having my, like, this is what I want to do with the show and this is how it's going to be, sometimes isn't always the best. And having those other opinions actually helps me think of things that I would have not thought of, because I was so laser focused on the ideas that I had set forth in my own brain. And sometimes people can explain my brain a little bit clearer than I can, which is a weird thing to say. But I learned that when I take the reins of producing and writing, it sometimes can get a little overwhelming. So I luckily am co-producing and co-writing this year. So I've learned throughout the years how to navigate it so it's a little bit easier and more fun, and ultimately creates a better product, I think.
Well, I don't think there's any question that trying to do both producing and writing any show, particularly musicals, but I think it is across the board, is very challenging. I mean, they're not necessarily even the same skill set and focus of energy. And even if they were, there's a thing called hours in the day. There's only so many hours, and sure, trying to do both is very challenging. In fact, I mean, for my producing the Edinburgh shows, almost all of them, there have been a few that we've developed in-house and you know, co-created from start, but most of them are people that have a finished product or a show that's in development and being written, and they just need somebody else to do the admin and the production side of things vis-a-vis the Fringe. No, it sounds like you were more or less commissioned, at least in the one instance, to write the show. So I'm not sure how the Fringe influenced you or not.
Right, that's a good way of thinking of it. My collaborator Steve Traska had the idea of doing a one-man show in the Fringe and booked the space and has dealt with every production aspect. And it was really up to me to focus on how to work songs into this thing, to turn it into a one-man musical. So that you were talking about the two different hats. of writer and producer. And really, I've been fortunate enough to only wear the one hat, the writing hat. And I actually don't know anything about the nuts and bolts of producing at the Fringe.
And in addition to that, you don't really, in other words, I was going to say you didn't care. That sounds harsh. That's not my point. The point is that you didn't have to write, you weren't writing for the Fringe. You were writing a one-man musical that happened to be programmed at the Fringe.
Yes, although we knew that his goal was to be in the Hollywood Fringe, and the writing was continuing. And most of the writing was done in January and February, and it didn't stop because we all went indoors. There's more writing to be done. It's still unfinished because, of course, the deadline for finishing the thing has been pushed back. So I'm going to take a few more months on that opening number because I now have that luxury.
But is there anything about what your process is that is tailored to the fact that it's going to be in the Fringe versus in a commercial run somewhere else?
Well, to me, the way I'd answer that question is that we took a tour of the theater and we filmed a little promotional video in the theater. So that gave me a sense of what the space is like, and the idea that it's a very small, it can't have 50 seats. I mean, it is such a small and intimate venue that I know that whatever my performer does, he's going to be that close to the audience. And that kind of affects what we do in terms of writing. There's for instance, when he sings a duet with a flute player, he's got to be those two different characters in a way that the audience understands when he is singing at the person who's playing the flute and when he's the person playing the flute. So he's playing two characters in front of an audience that is not 5 feet away from him.
Right. Michael, have you found that your writing process is tailored in any way to the fact that the show is going to be in the Hollywood Fringe or in Fringe generally, especially since you're on the main stage at the Broadwater, which is 99 seats-ish, and certainly a bigger space than a lot of so-called commercial intimate theaters in Los Angeles. So you're certainly not affected like Noel would be necessarily in writing to the space as much. But do you have other, there are other things about the festival being the end result or the end goal that affect the way you write?
I'd like to say that I'm an aspiring non-producer, and my ideal is to email somebody some PDF files and MP3 files and then show up for opening night. And
good luck with that.
Well, with Super Sidekick and later with Feast of Snacks, that was exactly what happened because I was working with Theater Unleashed, which is a self-contained theater company, and they took the reins and they did everything. They booked the venue, they produced it, they cast from among their own members, they found a music director, and I literally just showed up and had a great time, and that was a lot of fun. With The Bully Problem, I've been much more intimately involved in the production process from the beginning. NMI asked me to pitch a Fringe show. So The Bully Problem was a result of that interaction. I was been there for finding the director, overseeing casting, doing a lot of work in promoting the show. I was going to every event at the Fringe and meeting people and handing out business cards for the show. I spearheaded the social media. I did everything I could to get the word out about the production. I did a lot of podcast interviews, for example. And what's nice is that this speaks to such skills as I do have. I can promote well, and NMI is very good about the logistics of finding the theater and organizing things and providing rehearsal space. So it was still a lot of work to both be writing and rewriting and producing. At least the aspect of producing I was doing fit my skill set. So it wasn't, I didn't feel like I was out of my depth at any point.
Yes, my apologies. I had a little personal crisis this morning. Everything is fine. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, listen, we've had each of the other panelists sort of introduce themselves and give us a little brief synopsis of their musical experience with the Fringe, and then the next cycle was to talk about how you tailored your producing or writing of a musical for the Fringe in general, or for that matter, even more tailor it to the Hollywood Fringe. So I will turn it over to you to give us that introduction and conversation about tailoring.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Hello, my friends out there. So last year, I did my show Scarlet Fever, and I had not done an original creation at that point for about 12 years. I'd done most of my work back in New York City. So it had been about 12 years since I had mounted my own show. So I was sort of going, when you do one show after another, year after year, it just keeps flowing out. So I had a lot of just anxiety of sort of picking up something I hadn't done for about a decade. And when I came up with my idea and I decided I wanted to do my Fringe show, for me, I didn't think of it as I'm mounting a Fringe show. I just thought of it as I'm mounting a theatrical production. So that's how my mindset went into it. I did know, obviously, though, that I needed to write a show that was only an hour in length. I had an 8-member cast. This was I had created many shows over the years where I incorporated music of some kind, and it was usually simple melodies I came up with, and there was no arrangement or orchestration for it. And this year, I just decided, I just put my mind to it that I wanted to write original music finally. And I got together with Michael Tioli, who had done a lot of Fringe in the past. I knew he arranged very well, and I liked his sensibility. I liked always what I heard him produce. So basically, I got together with him, and I created these songs, wrote the lyrics, came up with the tunes, gave them to him. He then took them and he arranged them. He added his own flair to them. And so we ended up writing 4 songs. And it was interesting because I kept wavering. I didn't feel it was a full-fledged musical, even though some people saw it as a musical. There is live, I like incorporating live percussion in all of my shows. So the whole show has a musicality to it to begin with. And then this one finally had 4 actual songs that went along with it. And as for producing at the Fringe, like I said, I just looked at it as coming in and producing a show. And so not to sort of limit in my mind that, oh, this is a Fringe project. And, knock wood, luckily I had finances from my other job that I do. I was able to not be too concerned about finances. I sort of gave myself a budget. I was surprised, of course, in the end when it was that I actually spent a lot more money than I had thought I spent.
Does add up.
Yes, but I kind of hate to say this because I know not everyone is in that same boat, but I happen to have the money, and I hadn't done a show in a long time, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do. But I'm very conscious of expenses. Many of my shows back in New York were sort of site-specific, and we did them outside. And that I know sort of how to work in the confines of a budget. And, the theater that I had for the Fringe was the Broadwater main stage, which is the biggest physical space you can utilize at the Fringe, because I know I like depth and breadth for my performers, for the movement and so forth. And I knew that if I was going to have live music you sort of need to be in a big space, because if you're in a tiny black box, it's going to drown everybody out. So I knew that was going to be expensive. Let me know if I've been answering. I think was there anything more specific angle you wanted to hear?
No, you definitely are. That's perfect. And you mentioned something that I should have said, I should have asked about or talked about earlier, which is the fact that you wrote for an hour. I mean, you targeted an hour show, which again, many of you know that the Fringe model is sort of based around an hour time slot. It's not exclusive like Edinburgh. I mean, if you have a 2-hour show, good luck. You can certainly try and get a venue to give you a slot, and you'll find somebody. It won't be possibly the best time. It might not be, you know, the optimum, because everything is sort of, you know, focused on an hour. The musical I did at the Hollywood Fringe in 2016, Bumper Sticker, was a little longer. I don't remember exactly. I think it might have been 80 minutes. But generally speaking, I think the Fringe shows tend to be sort of in the hour range, because that's what the venues kind of think of, and that's the audiences are sort of trained to think in terms of hours as well. And so if your show is longer than that, it just is it's not going to cause any great consternation, but people are going to have to like, oh, that's an hour and 15. That means I can't go to that 9 p.m. show because, you know, mine lasts a little longer. And Michael and Spencer, did you what were your lengths, running times on yours?
The Bully Problem was 90 minutes, which was definitely a challenge because, as you say, it's atypically long for Fringe. And it was also a challenge developmentally because before the Fringe version of the show was written, it was clocking in at something like 2 hours and 40 minutes. So wow. It was a substantially larger show. But and to up the stakes, it was made clear to us that at 91 minutes, the lights were coming on and they were getting everybody else out of the theater. So it's not like we could spill over a little bit. There was absolutely no wiggle room. And Elise Dewsbury wisely reminded me that people applaud. You know, your show, well, hopefully, your show is not a continual thing that goes from start to finish at a anticipatory rate without any kind of breaks. So we had to very aggressively cut the show down, even after the point where I thought, this is perfect. It is the perfect vision of my dream. We still had to slice dialogue and remove scenes, and in one case, just cut a song.
Right.
Even I loved the song, it was just pushing us a little over that 90-minute barrier.
As Michael's co-producer, I would jump in and say that when we do a show at Fringe, we're extremely aware of that whatever slot, because in the theaters you buy a slot, you buy a 60-minute slot or 90-minute slot or whatever you want, but if you're in a 90-minute slot like we were for Bully Problem, you have 15 minutes to load this is a Fringe thing, so you have 15 minutes to load everything in, your people, your costumes, your set, any sound equipment you're using that isn't already there at the theater, and get everything set up and ready. And part of that 15 minutes is loading your audience in. So in reality, you have about 10 minutes and then the house is open. And you've got 5 minutes to herd everybody in and start the show. And then your 90 minutes starts. When your 90 minutes is over, you have 15 minutes to get the audience and everything out. And so as producers, NMI is really strict about saying, if it's a 90-minute slot, we want your show to come in at 80 minutes, maybe 85, not 90. Because we want to know, first of all, that as Michael said, if your audience is really loving the show and laughing, we don't want to start to get nervous that you're going to go over time. Give them an extra 5 minutes of laughing, but also give yourselves an extra 5 minutes. I like to, if I can manage it, I like to, as a house manager, I like to open the house 2 or 3 minutes into my 90 minutes if I can, because there's always latecomers, and otherwise you're going to spend with Michael's show, because of the time we got it down pretty tight, but I also knew as house manager we had to start right on the minute of our 90-minute start, which meant I had to turn the house over and start the show at that hour, no matter what was going on with my audience. And that meant during the whole opening number, audience was still streaming in. So these are the things you have to think about when you're getting a show produced at Fringe, because these are the parameters everybody at Fringe has to operate under.
Go ahead, Michael.
I'll give you another example of how this has artistic ramifications, how it actually affected how I wrote the show. I have a habit of ending a song with a button and then kind of a joke afterwards. And the idea is it thwarts our expectation for this big moment of applause. And there's some artistic it's been told to me that it kind of steals the moment away, and it's not a good idea to have that little extra joke after the end of a song. But there's also a big impact in terms of timing, because if you end a song on a button and leave room for applause, you can then take advantage of that applause period to change scenery, to move people away from the scene and move other people in. So there's a real time efficiency to allow that big applause process to happen. And because I realized it was a time issue, I started reconfiguring the end of the song and giving up my beloved little after song joke just so we could more tightly approximate that 90-minute limit.
Spencer, where have yours been in the 60-minute world? Or
So yeah, I always have booked an hour slot, but my shows generally are about 45 minutes, and I do that. I actually do that on purpose. So this is a whole like specific to Fringe thing. Is one, it allows me to actually have to write less. Which also forces me to realize what's integral to the story and what's not. Because I'm like, oh, this song, I love it, but I need to cut 3 minutes. I can cut the song because it doesn't matter. It's not relevant to the story, but it's a fun song. So I know that I can always bring it back later and do a longer version. But I've done 45 minutes. I put in an hour slot. People are like, I always ask this, and people always ask this: is your show actually an hour, or like, can I, if I see your show at 6, can I go to a show at 7? If it's like right across the street? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. My show is under 50 minutes. But I also do that because, especially with Studio C and some of the venues, Studio C actually has the bathroom behind the stage. So I have to also incorporate that into my load in and load out time, where I have to have enough time to load in and also have the audience go to the bathroom line. And then once the audience is done, then the show can start because they're crossing the stage. And I've also had the issue of parking in Hollywood is always tricky. And I have people coming a couple minutes late and people panic about it. And if I see like my show, like for instance, last year was a good indicator because my show sold out its run. And I would get to like 2 minutes before the show and half of my audience wasn't there yet. And I was like, I don't know. And my stage manager was like, your show's running 40 minutes in a 45-minute slot, and you booked an hour slot. So we can hold the house a couple minutes, because generally with Fringe you can't hold because there's another show loading in and out right after you. But because of the space that I booked, the time slot that I booked, the actual length of my show, it was okay for me not to freak out as the producer, who's also about to go perform on stage as the actor, because that also happened a lot, where I was like, okay, I can hold a couple minutes and let the audience trickle in. And that worked out really well because I had that buffer. So I always try to write the shows with that in mind too, especially if I'm doing a show for Fringe, that, okay, let me write, maybe an hour's worth of show, and then what can I cut it down to 45? But sometimes I'll be like, the show's 35 minutes. I really want to make it 45, but I'm like, why? I can book a 45-minute slot, and really I guess it'd be more of like an hour slot, but it's 35 minutes, and if I hold for laughter, I hold for applause, I hold the house a couple minutes at the beginning, give myself a couple more minutes for load in and load out, it's going to be about a 45-minute show. As Lisa and Michael were saying, with the applause and the laughter, you've got to account for that, especially if it's a funny show, because people will hopefully be laughing because you hopefully wrote a funny show. But that's the biggest thing I learned, is to book a time slot and then cut out about 10 or 15 minutes of the actual time slot I've booked. So if it's an hour, making my show 45 to 50 minutes, to also allow people to, hey, I've got to drive over to Actors Company or Studio Stage, and the show starts 15 minutes after your show. And I was like, as long as you can find parking, I can't guarantee you'll make it, but I can give people that ability to know that they are able to make it if they're within a close range, because I've given them enough time to actually leave. The only caveat is if you say your show is 45 minutes on the Fringe guide and it's an hour, that's a no-no. Don't do that. So I always try to go a longer time than a shorter time, because I can always, if I say it's an hour and then it ends up being an hour, great. If I say it's an hour and it's 45 minutes, great. But if I say it's 45 minutes and an hour, that's not good. So I've learned to just kind of write for a time that I'm aiming for and kind of stick within that time frame.
Noel, do you remember what the time slot was for Murder at the Savoy?
It had to have been less than an hour and more than a half hour. And I say that because when I wrote it so many years ago, I remember recording it, and it fit on one side of a 90-minute cassette.
Got it. Okay.
So that's how I know.
Fair enough. Good enough reason. What everyone's, I think, made reference to the fact that you could, there are Fringe versions, and then there are other versions. I mean, I've produced a handful of shows, including musicals, that at the Fringe, they had to cut a song or two or a scene or whatever to accommodate the reality of an hour, or even in some cases a slightly longer time slot. But that show then was produced commercially, either frankly before or after the Fringe, and those songs were added back, and the running time was, you know, closer to an hour 40 or whatever. I think there is a trend, and at least certainly correct me, or any of you correct me if you think that's wrong, but I do think there's a trend to shorter shows, period. I mean, regardless of the Fringe or not, I think in the world, in society, there is a trend to write musicals without or shows, but musicals in particular without intermission.
Yes, I think the intermissionless 90-minute one act has become the wave of the current time in both musicals and non-musicals. And it used to be you always had to have an act break, and it just isn't the case anymore. And I think people actually are almost disappointed when they find out there's an act break now.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's that aspect of it, and that helps to get it into the Fringe mold. Look, my first big success in Edinburgh. Well, my second, I had a very lucky run of a couple of shows that did incredibly well when I first started. And the second one was a one-man show that with an intermission ran 2 hours. And I don't think I'd be able to book that show now. That was 20 years ago, and Edinburgh was a bit more tolerant of that. I can't remember the last time. Certainly the two musicals I did in the last few years did not have intermissions and ran in the 75-minute range. So one other thing that I was going to ask you guys about, it's been on my mind particularly lately because of my own experience with a regular play, not a musical, and that is equity. And I wonder have any of you used equity actors in any of your Fringe productions? Because equity is now, as all of us know, I guess, 10 years ago it would have been a non-issue. You would have just, done the 99-seat agreement, and there was no real costs involved, not as a practical matter. But now, with the requirement that you pay minimum wage for rehearsal and performance, that makes a large cast musical at the festival quite a bit more expensive. So I was just curious, John, in particular, you had a large cast.
I had a cast of 8, and that was one of my first calls. I mean, I worked with Sacred Fools for many years, so I knew what was going on with equity. That was one of my first calls, though, just to hear from someone at equity, and immediately it was because if you were in a 50-seat or less theater, you were in a much better position.
Yeah, the showcase agreement, right? Because
they let you kind of get away with that. But I had to be on that 99-seat stage, and that just immediately would have meant minimum wage for the rehearsal. It would have meant me, getting a for a bill pay. It would have to get insurance. It would have been literally probably it probably would have been about another 10,000 or more added on to it. I mean, more probably. So I have it's interesting, working with, and this is very different being in LA than being in New York, I feel. And especially working with a musical, the number one thing is you need people to know how to sing. And I say this in there are non-equity, there are many more women. There's a plethora of wonderfully talented women. I'm not really sure why, but to find non-union men was is struggle for me. And I really am not really sure why that is. A non-union, I mean, being union or
sorry, John, we lost you. You've frozen up for some reason.
Yeah, I would just to finish John's thought until he gets a chance to do it himself. I think that anyone who sits behind the producing desk in casting knows that there are always more talented women than men available out there in the business, whether you're in musicals or non-musicals, equity or non-equity. But what that tends to mean is that really talented men will become union more quickly than talented women. They're just, it's just a fact. And I can only say that if there's any reason for it, it's more likely because women are more drawn to the field than men. And so there just are more of us than there are men. So I think anyone who's ever cast will tell you you could cast your show 5 times over with talented women, and you are going to be spending hours scraping the bottom of the barrel to get good men into your show.
Now, that may be true across the board. So Spencer and Michael, I tell you, you had non-equity actors as well in your shows?
Yeah, I had non-equity. For a couple of my shows, I was curious as to like how much more it would add to the budget and like some of the logistics of everything. So I had called equity for a show. I don't remember if it was 2017 or 2018. I think it might have been my show in the middle of the last 3 years. And it was like, okay, there's more budget. And they're like, and basically for the 50 seat at the time, she basically said that I have to pay each of my equity actors at the highest rate of whatever I'm paying any of my other staff. And it came to the point where I was like, a lot of this is fringe and a lot of it's volunteer. And does volunteer count as funds? And it's like, because then really that person would be the highest paid on my crew. And I wasn't opposed to that. It was more of like, okay, now I've got to figure out if I've got to pay other people. And then if I'm paying other people, then that's going to increase my budget. And then it's like, but then also there has to be a certain kind of rehearsal space and this and that. And I was like, I like to do like, let's all meet at someone's place and like rehearse to save on budget, because the budget just starts to get astronomical. But with equity, that's not the case, even with the 50 seat, because I was in like 38 seat houses. And so it also got to the point where it was like May when I called them and they're like, it's not too late, it's not too late. And then I was getting all these things I had to do as someone who was producing and writing and starring in their show. I was like, I just don't know if I can handle this as well, because it was a lot of extra material. Now, had I made that phone call in December or January, knowing what show I was going to be doing, that may have been more doable because I would have had the extra months to plan it out, or having, like, for instance, this year having co-producers to actually take care of that work is great. But knowing that, like, I'm an independent producer producing from my own budget and my own, like, I don't even really have a company necessarily, but producing my own stuff, it's a lot of extra funds and a lot of extra time that I already didn't have. But I also know that with equity actors, there are a lot of equity actors who are incredible and you want to book them. And then you go and do an open call for non-union actors and you're like, I just saw a non-union actor who I think is just as good as the equity actor, and the non-union actor is cheaper. So it's this tricky thing where it's like, there are great performers in equity. There's also great performers in non-union. And if I had the choice, if it's a difference between several $1,000s, I'm going to pick the one that's cheaper because they're equally talented. Now, if there's no one in the non-union realm that is talented and the equity is the only talented group of people, then for sure, I would rather have the talent over the logistics and the budget, because the talent is important to make the show a success and to make it actually make the vision come to life. But when there's so many, as John was saying, and Elise was saying, as there are so many talented non-union actors, my first thought is always to go non-union first. And then if I don't find what I need, then go to equity. But then at that point, sometimes it gets a little too late.
Yeah, and let me just invite all of you, all of the attendees, to send any questions you have by chat. And especially if you want to address that question to a particular panelist, please note that in your message. But we should definitely open it up to questions. And if any of you have any that you want asked, please send them to us in the chat function. And Michael, I'll let you, as far as I know, you were also non-equity, and indeed, obviously the bullet problem with NMI was, and your experience otherwise with the Fringe has been non-equity, I take it.
It has been. Like Spencer, I called up equity and I asked, what would it cost to bring in an equity actor? And I remember breaking into laughter because the answer was about 1/3 of our overall budget per actor. It was partially because we were in the 99-seat Broadwater main stage, so the scale goes up based on the number of seats, and we had a cast of 16, which also puts you in the highest possible category. This isn't a strategy so much as what happened, but I've had luck in finding people who were extremely talented, kind of pro-grade talent, who just graduated, and then grabbing them right out of college before they joined the union. So I've had a couple of cases where from project to project, I would call up people who are in a show and discover they had rightfully sought their fortunes in equity. So it's cut down on my ability to retain cast members across projects, but it has allowed me to get some really talented people who might otherwise be out of my price range.
And your characters are young, Michael.
They
Right.
have been, yeah. So that's made it tougher as well. Well, it's helped in that it's easier to get people out of college, but it's also a tough demographic in terms of finding a certain level of vocal skill.
Well, speaking of costs, Isabel posed a very good question, and that is, what is the typical budget for a fringe musical, or at least a range of low to high? And I'll start out by saying that Bumper Sticker, which was union at the time because this was before the equity 99 seat rules changed, and so at the time we did engage equity actors in Bumper Sticker, but we were still under the old so-called waiver plan, and we're only required to pay per diems, essentially smaller, gas money in essence, and we wouldn't have been able to employ those equity actors under the current provision of minimum wage. And that budget, so let's assume it was a non-union equivalent, and that budget was around 20 grand approximately, and that was a cast of 7, if I remember correctly, and we did I think we did 6 shows with a live band. So I will go over to Spencer, since you probably have the most volume of musicals. What are the budget ranges been for you?
Sure. So I always go on with the idea of I'm not going to pay anything, and that never obviously happens because there are costs associated. I will say I think registration is usually, I think it's $300 now is what they're charging, and that's like you have to pay that in order to do your show if you want to charge for tickets.
$350 this year.
Sorry?
It was $350 this year.
Oh, $350. Okay, so it did go up.
Wait, no, maybe it was $250 last year and it's $300 this year. It's something like that. Sorry.
It's not the cheapest registration fee. It might be $350 now. But then you have a venue cost, which is based on your amount of shows that you want. If you want 1 show, it's going to be cheaper than if you want 5 shows. But if you get a 5-show package, generally it's less per show overall because there's a little bit of a discount based on the package that you're purchasing. And that between the registration and venue, I've gotten to about between $1,250 to $1,500 for the smaller venues. Then that doesn't include stage manager fees or any rehearsal time that you want. You have to pay the stage manager, per show, whatever their rate is, and then props. If you want to pay actors and a director and producers to do all the work, it really depends on who you have in your network and how much they charge, or if you want to hire for publicity, marketing, all that stuff. I think one year I broke even on my show because I guess like last year I made like $1 because I was able to sell enough tickets at full price to essentially pay for the venue and the registration fee. But I wouldn't necessarily say that I paid off all the props and everything, but I just have those props now for another time. But I mean, I depending on your show and your budget, I went on the lower end and I was probably about $2,000 to $3,000 in total for everything. But I also, on the caveat, is that I know with Fringe, the props and the set can get a little expensive. So my set last year was the cubes that were in the space, and I bought a bunch of cups that I used. I did JAMBA Juice the musical last year, so we just had cups and then like cardboard cutouts of things that were costumes. So I didn't use that, and we used tracks. My composer played the recorded tracks. I would rather have had them live, but so that's another factor. If you're playing it yourself, I guess that's one thing, but if you're hiring a band, that's another cost for every live performance, whatever the rate is for a guitarist, a pianist, if you have any other instruments, percussion. So it really just depends on your budget and how much you want to incorporate into Fringe, whether you want to do live or recorded, and if you want to do a smaller house or a bigger house.
Yeah, the live music component of Bumper Sticker and in general, I have found that musicians aren't really, they don't care that it's the Fringe. That's your problem, basically. I mean, they're professional musicians, and they're like, yeah, it's a gig, and so if I'm playing to 10 people or an arena, my rate is X, and a good MD, a good musical director, is probably gonna have a sort of a similar attitude. I mean, they may work with you a little bit, but I mean, look, if you're doing a solo musical and there's no set or props or costuming costs to speak of, and you wrote the musical yourself and have no royalties to pay or any fees, you could certainly do a Fringe show for a couple of grand relatively easily, because that's the cost of the registration and the cost of the the venue. Doesn't include any marketing, doesn't include any add-ons, but that's that's on the lower end. Larger cast, if it's non-union and they're not paying them, doesn't particularly affect that if you're using pre-recorded tracks. Michael, do you remember what or at least for that matter, the budget on the Bully Problem, sort of roughly?
I would probably defer to Elise. She probably remembers the numbers better than I do. What I'll add to whatever she says is I ponied up some of my own money for some items that were not in the budget, some promotional items like postcards. And I want a website. I had a website designed for the show, which was really important in popularizing it. And also a cast album recording. I really felt like I wanted to capture that magic while it was still fresh in everybody's head. So I rushed everybody into the studio as soon as I could get their schedules together. And we recorded the tracks for the cast album. And that's a pretty penny as well. As for the main production budget, I'll defer to Elise because she probably remembers better than I do.
Yeah, in general, we try to keep a Fringe show budget to something like $8,000 in that range. And our aim is to break even. There's no intention there of making any money. What you pray is that you pray that you're not going to lose money, but you certainly are not intending to make any money. So you're trying to design a show that where the ticket sales will return your cost, basically, and that's not an easy thing to pull off, but you do the best you can. We also look at it as, and this is a way to think of Fringe, I think. We're a developmental organization. We help musical theater writers write their musicals, and we think that the Fringe is a perfect development opportunity because the production expectations from your audience are really low. So we used to produce at the NoHo Arts Center a full-fledged production. We did several world premieres there, and our budgets there were $50,000 to $60,000, and that was on the cheap. We were finding it hard to get them done properly. But that's because you're renting the theater all on your own. You're not sharing it with 6 different shows that are appearing, an hour before you and an hour after you. You have to hire lighting designer and set designer, and everything has to look beautiful. In Fringe, you can't really do anything with the lights. They are what they are. The lights are hung the way they're hung. You can turn them on and turn them off, and but you can't rehang them, refocus them, or do fancy gobos or anything. So your audience doesn't expect it. Your audience knows that you have to load your set in and your costumes and props in 15 minutes before your show, so they don't have high expectations. They expect to see it done on the cheap, and that's sort of it's a beautiful thing about the whole the whole ambiance of Fringe is that it's sort of like Mickey and Judy, let's put on a show. And in my opinion, that's perfect for development because you're just checking out the show. You're trying it out. You're seeing how it works. You're trying to get an audience response with an idea that somewhere down the road you might fully produce it in a theater in its own run, and then you're going to spend, upwards of $75,000, $100,000 even in a small theater. So that's why. So we try to keep it to $7,000 or $8,000, and we embrace the fact that it is a developmental production.
Yeah, I mean, we in Edinburgh, things are a bit more expensive. The registration fee. By the way, Gordon was kind enough to check, and apparently the registration fee is $300 for a multi-performance and $175 for a free or single performance show at the Hollywood Fringe. The registration in Edinburgh is around the same. It's a little more expensive because it's in pounds, although the pound is taking a pounding. Excuse the pun. But it's in the same range. The venues are a bit more expensive, and there are more costs to market and stuff that you almost have to do there. And I mean, I did Reanimator the musical, which was a big hit here in LA, and in Edinburgh it cost around $60,000 because it was a large cast, but that's travel, transportation, well, that's redundant, housing for people, et cetera, that you wouldn't necessarily have you certainly wouldn't have in Hollywood, generally speaking. Although the play I just produced at the Electric Lodge in March opened on Thursday and closed on Sunday because of the pandemic, was a New York cast. It was an Edinburgh show. It was an Edinburgh production of an LA-based playwright's play, and so we actually flew in the Equity cast from New York to accomplish the equivalent production, and it added a lot of cost to that as well. And the reason I bring that up is because we basically closed and wanted to stream it, and so we went ahead and did the archival recording under the new contract for 99-seat theaters with Equity. You can do an archival recording if everyone agrees, and you have to pay a little bit of a bonus to the actors to do that. And without more, it's just that, an archival recording, and there's certain restrictions. You certainly can't stream it or sell it, commercially. It's meant as an archive, as the name suggests. However, because we had to close early, we did approach Equity to allow us to stream it, and after quite a bit of delay and back and forth, we managed to get the rights to stream it for a 2-week window, and the fees due to the actors and stage manager were pretty substantial, but we had already agreed to pay the actors and stage manager for a 3-week run and committed to that, and indeed paid them for that. And Equity did allow us, and the performers, the cast, allowed us to apply that extra money, if you will, to the fees that were due for streaming. So, it's interesting. There's a lot of conversations now, and I'm sure everyone has had so much new content that they've seen, a lot of it musical oriented, online. I don't know yet what's going to happen with Equity in terms of streaming shows in general, and musicals, of course, offer some particular challenges because of the music, if nothing else. So I'm not sure where we're headed for that. I mean, Hollywood Fringe has said they're going to have a virtual online Fringe regardless, I guess. That's the impression I get. Edinburgh, also a couple of sort of sub-fringes like the Free Fringe there, which is part of the overall Edinburgh Fringe, but it's got its own sort of promoter and stuff, and it's free. It's not ticketed generally, and they're going to do a virtual online festival in August as well. So that remains to be seen. Laura Cody asks, how many Fringe shows go on to bigger things? Excellent question, because as Elise pointed out, the purpose of doing a Fringe show, as a producer in Edinburgh, I've done like 70 shows there, mostly for clients that come to us and need a producer, and they say, why should we do Edinburgh? And it is always, a combination of, it's a great time, which may or may not be enough reason to spend $25,000. It's a great development tool for the show, and you might get some awesome reviews, and they absolutely have. And so in terms of what shows go on to bigger and better things, most of the musicals I produced there were already hits here. I mean, they'd already had a commercial run in the United States, and so they may have circled back to some extent, and they did, but they didn't. It's not that they got a big boost from being in Edinburgh, because they'd already had some success. Bumper stickers, sadly, we've not been able to find the money, because doing an off-Broadway run is multiple six figures as a practical matter, and we just haven't found a way to progress that show, even though it was very well received. So yeah, Michael, what's you say that ran in Edinburgh 2 to 3 years ago, is now Check Out 6. Yeah, that was actually just in the news recently, because I think it was supposed to open on Broadway, right in the middle of the pandemic, right?
Yes.
A show about Henry VIII's 6 wives was a big hit in Edinburgh. Look, there have been plenty of shows. Jerry Springer the musical essentially started in Edinburgh and then became a big hit in London and New York. So there's certainly examples of it over and over again. But I don't know so far that any of our shows, of the people that were on the panel, have had any major commercial runs after the Fringe production, but I could be wrong. John, is there any plans for Scarlet Fever going forward?
Not at the moment. Ideally, I think all of us would. Fringe has such a built-in audience base, so it's not as fearful. If I just suddenly said I was going to just go produce Scarlet Fever, I'm just going to rent my own theater, get me a PR person, and I wasn't connected with an established theater, that would be very frightening to me. If I could, produce it through Sacred Fools or through another theater that's already established, then you move to the next level of they already have their built-in audience and sort of their PR machine and their history of who they are. So that would ideally be what I would want to do, is hook up with an established theater. I mean, back in New York, I, produced all my own stuff, and it takes a long time for you to kind of establish a name, and especially if you're doing a new work, it's very frightening in that way. That wasn't in my mind thinking about it. Obviously, I'd like to, but I want to stick with Fringe for now, because at least it has that built-in audience that some people are going to come see that show. You don't have to sit and worry about that aspect of it, which is why I think it's such a wonderful thing to produce at Fringe, because I think it really relieves one of the major anxieties any producer has. No matter how good your show is, if no one comes to see it, it's really disheartening. So that's why I'm now going to stick with the Fringe, and I think it's also expectations one sets for themselves. I would hate for someone to say, oh, I'm going to do a Fringe show because I know that I'm going to be seen and I'm going to go on to something. It's happened, but just make sure you set your expectations and don't assume things might transpire out of it. If they do, fantastic. But I think just focus on that production you're doing at the Fringe. What may transpire after that is just all gravy on top of that.
Right, and as we're going to get to a question that Makina gave us in just 1 second, but I'm going to remind everyone that Fleabag started at the Edinburgh Fringe, and of course went on to an off-Broadway run, and now it's a television hit. That show, ironically, I don't know if irony is the right word, but just oddly enough, it wasn't that awesomely reviewed in Edinburgh. It got a couple like mediocre reviews, and it wound up becoming a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, Hannah Gadsby, she didn't do Nanette at Edinburgh, but that's where she got her start. And as Michael pointed out, a lot of comedians get their start from the Edinburgh Fringe in particular. Hollywood hasn't yet really become a comedy hotbed. I'm trying to change that. I produced some stand-up last year and was going to produce a sketch show this year. And I'm on a panel of a competition in Edinburgh, the Muse Moose Awards, and the woman that won that last year got a deal from it, a TV deal, and that's happened so many times. In Edinburgh, if you win what used to be called the Perrier is now called the Dave Award. The Dave is a comedy channel in the UK. If you win Best Comedian in the Dave Awards, you have a career in comedy instantly. You will become a huge superstar and tour and get a television show in the UK. It's amazing, actually. And then, as Spencer also pointed out, there was a show in the Hollywood Fringe in 2019 called Supportive White Parents. That was a solo show that actually went on to become...
it was a musical.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, it was a musical, 6-person musical. It started out as a 30-minute show, or it did like a 25-minute run at UCB. Then they did a 30-minute version of it at Fringe, and then it was nominated for awards. It won an encore, and then Second City picked it up, and it ran starting in August of 19. And it was extended continuously, but then obviously the pandemic hit, so Second City's currently closed. But it has been running since then, and it's been selling out like every weekend. It's once a week, and it sells out every show, so that's why they keep extending it. So that could run for a max of 2 years. And Trump in Space also did that. A couple Fringes before, they were picked up to go to Second City, and they ran for 2 years at Second City, and then they closed officially because Second City was like, 2 years.
I must be thinking, I'm confusing it with another solo show that we gave a pick of the Fringe to, because that one was a solo show. So I'm confusing it with that one. I'm sorry, Supportive White Parents. I'm not thinking of that, because the one I was thinking of is a solo show without music, and you're telling me this is a 6-cast musical. So that's more on point for this today. And Elise and Michael point out something also, which is good to know, and that is that the Fringe run might make you eligible for getting the play published. And his show, Super Sidekick, did get published as a result of the Fringe runs, and that could happen. Bukowsical also got published as a result of winning the New York Fringe. Any event, getting to Makina's question, which is how do musical writers connect with potential producers to bring shows to Edinburgh? And I guess we could extend that even to include Hollywood. I'm sure it's tough to self-produce and competitive to blindly submit to different production companies. What's the process for finding an interested producer? Well, look, I mean, I wish I had some magical answer for you. I think it is somewhat just submitting to producers blindly. Although the blindness of it can be mitigated by doing a bit of homework, of course, and making sure that your show fits at least as well as you can learn and research that producer's interests and what they've done in the past. The Hollywood Fringe producer of being bumper stickers producer was as a result of the composing team had written another musical, that being Bukowsical, that I had produced previously. So that's how they associated with me. Otherwise, I think you just have to do research and find, this is just I want to hear everyone's opinion. My opinion would be just to, take a look at your show and take a look at the Edinburgh program for musicals. I mean, the problem with Edinburgh, of course, is there's, 4,000 shows, and I'm not sure how many musicals, but a lot. Hollywood Fringe is pretty popular genre as well, and just sort of reverse engineer it and look at shows that seem to be consistent with what you're selling in terms of genre. Well, genre is a musical, but subgenre, whether it's a solo show, whether what the subject of it is, etc., and then reach out to those producers that have already shown an interest in those types of shows. But I open it to my fellow panelists.
Right. Well, Edinburgh is so huge, it's kind of hard to give one answer to the question. As you point out, thousands of shows are coming, and they're coming from all over the world. So, the show from Africa might have a different pathway than a show from America would. One thing that I would point out to answer this question is that there are many American companies and particularly schools that regularly take shows to Edinburgh, and that's like something they're geared up to do every summer. And what they bring is going to change from summer to summer. They're not going to re-bring the same show. So if you can find one of those companies and pitch your musical to them, then that's someone who's regularly traveling to Edinburgh who might be in the market for a new musical.
Another strategy you could take if you wanted to approach Edinburgh independently is to go to the festival, get a feel for what's there, and network, meet producers, see a lot of musicals. And when you see a show that reflects your own aesthetics, whose production impresses you, track down the producers while you're at the festival, introduce yourself, say, I was thinking of bringing this show next year. Would this be any interest to you? And the advantage of this approach is you'll be networking with the people who have the practical experience at that festival, which I have to stress is huge and is its own world. There's a real home team advantage to people in the UK who just have easy physical access to that space and who may have connections to people at the festival. But if you can't find a producer here who is in the regular business of shuttling shows to Edinburgh, go to the festival and break bread with the people who are already doing it. They have the skill set that you want.
Go ahead, Spencer.
I was going to say, bouncing off of what Michael just said as far as networking, I haven't attempted Edinburgh yet because it's a scary thing for me to, with my shows. I haven't found the right show that I think I want to take there yet. But for this new show this year that I'm doing, I have a co-producer, and that company I met through Hollywood Fringe. And we kind of went to office hours and we kind of clicked a lot, and they came to my show. I went to their show and I told them about my idea for this year. And they were like, that sounds like it matches our bylaws and like what our company's mission is. Would you be interested in co-producing it with us? And I was like, absolutely, let's do it. And so I think that it is like, as people said, going to Edinburgh and meeting those producers, but finding those shows and those people that you click with and seeing kind of what engages you within what they're producing or what they're working on. Because if it's someone that I don't get along with, it might not be the best like fit. But since it was a group of people that I was like, yeah, we hung out a lot at Fringe and we really enjoyed each other's company, and their mission statement kind of matches the kind of theater that I want to tell, and they like the idea of my show, that's how we ended up combining forces and co-producing my show for this year. So I would say that same idea kind of transfers over to any festival, including Edinburgh.
I agree with that. I think the overlay works for Hollywood. I mean, it's a smaller world, so there's not as many possibilities in that respect. But absolutely, networking, going to the office hours. Michael referenced that some of you may not know the Hollywood Fringe had, and I'm not sure if they're still doing the virtual one even now, but certainly during regular times they would have a weekly meetup at a bar, in Hollywood, and it was a chance for everyone to pass out their postcards or just talk about their, what they're doing. And I mean, a lot of relationships have been formed. Some romantic too, presumably, but I meant business ones have been formed as a result of the office hours, which are sort of like happy hours. John, do you have any further to add on that relationship networking?
I can't commentate on Edinburgh, but obviously networking is very important. I happen to be a one-man band. So I directed, I produced my own show. I did it enough back in New York where it didn't scare me. I do know that I think everything I know of Edinburgh and the people who have gone there, I would not have that be your first foray into the Fringe, especially if you're coming from the States. Start small and understand what a Fringe is about. But also, people love to talk, and people at the Fringe love to tell you about who they are and what they do. So I know it can be intimidating, but as Michael said, just walk up to that producer, and I think 99% of the people are going to be wanting to engage with you, and definitely they will talk your ear off and let you know exactly what it is they can do and what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately as a producer, my job is to find new material that I'm passionate about on whatever level. And so I am absolutely in that 99% of people that would be completely cool and happy about somebody coming up and up to a point, because some people are not as artful about it as others, but basically, telling me that they have a show and would I take a look at it, or would I listen to it, or do I have any thoughts about it, et cetera. And John's point is incredibly well taken about starting small. Now that the Hollywood Fringe is available, in the last few years, I have increasingly had shows premiere at the Hollywood Fringe if they weren't already successful runs or whatever, but we would do sort of a test run at the Hollywood Fringe on the way to Edinburgh. And there's other ways to do that that aren't necessarily Fringe festivals. Like there's East 59th has East to Edinburgh, which they do every year in New York. So if you have an Edinburgh show that's booked and solidly in a venue in Edinburgh, then you can get a couple performances out of East 59th, which is actually a pretty nice theater. So I would recommend that. Yeah, I mean, I guess we've got a few minutes left. So unless there's any other, okay. Can you talk about strategies to advertise your show in the Fringe? How do you get your show to stand out among all the other Fringe shows? Asked Richard Castle. And that is a huge challenge, especially in Edinburgh. But let's focus on Hollywood. And I will, any of you can answer that question better than I, because
well, this was the best investment I made. And you're a walking billboard. And I assumed that I would see hundreds of shows with t-shirts, and I actually saw very few. And you walk into the bar, you walk into the Plunge or Fringe Central, you're a walking billboard. So I there are more than enough t-shirt manufacturers in LA. I highly recommend from the beginning of that process, you get t-shirts for yourself and your cast and you tell them to wear it. Don't go insane on postcards, you know, get your 500, maybe 1,000, because they sort of get lost in the shuffle. Always have it on you, maybe have a business card. And I think honestly, the biggest strategy of advertising, sadly in a strange way, is out of your hands, because it's the word of mouth after that first performance. And that's, I believe, what ultimately drives you. For next year, I'm reconsidering the $350 or whatever it was to actually put an ad in the hard copy. I don't know if that was worth that $350. So that's my experience. It is really, it's that word of mouth is that best advertising. But I highly recommend t-shirts.
Well, I will add to that with respect to advertising. In Edinburgh, we've experimented with various advertising plans, and I'm yet to be convinced that any of them are beneficial. With respect to the Hollywood Fringe, I spent a couple of years ago, I had 2 shows at the Hollywood Fringe that were had been hits in Edinburgh. So it was west to LA as opposed to east to Edinburgh. And I spent money to buy full page ads in the Hollywood Fringe program. And I'm not convinced that I sold a single ticket as a result of that. There was a unfortunate lady who bought the back cover of the Hollywood Fringe a couple of years ago. And I don't think I went to see her show for Pick of the Fringe, and there were 2 people in the audience. And that was my understanding of the success of her run in general. And she had paid for the back page of the program. So I'm not a big fan of advertising. I've tried, and I'll buy some Facebook ads and do a little bit of a mix in that respect. But word of mouth is king at any festival, absolutely. The postcards in the Hollywood Fringe, I agree, are kind of posters. There's no place to put them. You might be able to put a couple up at the venue and a couple up in the Fringe Central, but that's the extent of it. So there's not a lot. I mean, Broadwater will allow you to put up a banner, and some of the other places will as well. But there's not a whole lot of place for visual advertising in the traditional sense. Certainly not like Edinburgh. And it's got to be word of mouth, and that's absolutely the most influential thing about people buying tickets to your show.
I will say, going off of the guerrilla marketing budget, where I try not to spend money on marketing if I can, because I know that word of mouth is the most important. I think last year I was like, did I even have postcards last year? And I don't even think that I had any kind of like actual physical thing to give to people. And I still managed to sell out my show. So I managed to sell out my show with no postcards or flyers or anything, versus the other years when I did have postcards and flyers, and I think that's also goes back to networking, because I have like this weird thing of seeing like 75 shows a year. And so people know that I will go support their shows. So in turn, they want to support my show. And I think that that's another thing about the networking with Fringe, is it is a community. So if you go and support a lot of shows, then people are more likely to come and support yours because you're involving yourself within the community. But when John had mentioned business cards, I will never forget the one time in 2017, I gave out business cards, and people give out flyers that are a little bit bigger than what fits in a wallet. And someone goes, I'm coming to your show. I'm like, why? They're like, because your business card that you gave me is in my wallet, and every day I take it out because I have to get to whatever I need. And so I'm always reminded of your show. And it's the only show I remember because it fits in my wallet and I never take it out, and it always is there. So if you're going to do physical things, I almost think business cards are a better way to go, because people put it in their wallet and they'll forget about it, and then they'll look and, oh, that show's playing. Oh my goodness, it's crazy. I keep forgetting that your show's there, but every day I see it. So that made me think, if I have something that's easily accessible for people to literally stick in their wallet or like in a purse, it's a lot easier for them to remember it, because they're constantly pulling it out to get something else, but they'll remember the show. Yeah,
and another technique that's been noted in the chat is that you want to get that, because it is word of mouth, you want to get that first performance, the first preview as full as possible. And it's absolutely appropriate and desired to, well, not desired, but you should comp as many, if you have to paper the house through gold star, seat fillers, whatever, do it, because that, it's sort of like an airline. If that airplane takes off with an empty seat, they'll never recapture that income. And if you haven't sold the tickets, give them away, because you want people to see the show and talk, and talk it up and give it good word of mouth. That's a major factor as well.
Since an aspect of the question was how to stand out, one thing I'll suggest strongly is put a lot of time and thought into the poster image for your show. Even if that poster never physically appears on a wall anywhere in Hollywood, it's going to be part of your online marketing and your online advertising. And the sad truth is that most show posters are amateurish. So if you get something that looks good, you're immediately going to have an eye-catching impact, and that can make a big difference. For some reason, my poster came out backwards, but I uploaded it here so you can see a little bit about it. There are better places to see it, but I made sure that both for Bully Problem and for Getting the Blundersnorp, we had an image that was professional quality, and also managed to get across the idea of the show in one glance. So if you look at this image, or if you go to GIDEONmusical.com, you'll say, okay, I know what that's about. And that's what you want in your poster. A musical is a very complicated experience that evolves over time. And if you try to pitch the story to somebody, they're going to fall asleep. If you can give them an image that says, this is what you're in for, you've taken a lot of the work out of the process.
And I do think another good thing for me was probably every 2 or 3 days, I produced another 15, 30-second, 45-second video. During the rehearsal process, make sure your actors sign waivers at the beginning of the process to give the right to do that. But my show was very physical, and it's one thing for me to talk about it, but it's the visual that make people understand it. Now, if you're doing a straight play a video, I don't know how helpful that is. But if you're doing physical theater, you're doing musical, and you can have a snippet, start producing video content. That was also something surprising that I thought I would see more of. Now that it's kind of very easy for people to edit stuff together, and keep putting that content out, and don't be afraid to keep producing new videos, because the physical medium of hearing music, if someone hears a nice song to a show, you're going to be inclined to want to go see what the rest of that show is. So use video, the medium of that. It's much more powerful than just a static image on a page.
Yeah, I agree with that. You had a lovely, the show also had some, like the costume and the dress and stuff like that was visually impactful, including the physicality of the show. I think that's pretty much it. We're up against the 90 minutes. All of us, I shouldn't speak for all of us, but I will. I'm sure would be happy to hear from you through you can message us through the website, right? Through the Hollywood Fringe website.
Yes, or anybody who wants more information or contact information is welcome to email me at New Musicals Inc. And the address here is admin, ADMIN, at NMI for newmusicalsinc.org. You're welcome to email us and for contact information for anybody, and of course to find out anything more about how we operate with developing new musicals. Just give us a little commercial. And we hope that we'll see many, many more musicals at the Fringe Festival, whether it's in October or whenever it happens again. Lots of musicals, especially new musicals. And I want to encourage, of course, we have fabulous writers here and producers with us in the group. I also want to encourage lots more women and people with various different viewpoints. We want to try to get every story we can out there, and musicals are a great way to tell stories. So that world is open for everybody. So come tell us if you've got a story you want to tell.
Well, thanks, Elise, and thanks, NMI, for hosting this, and Michael for organizing it. And I hope it was helpful to all of you. And hopefully I'll see you at the Hollywood Fringe in October, or we'll communicate in some virtual way before and or after that.
That would be great.
But it was really nice, and thank you to all the panelists as well. So
thanks to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Reach out
everyone.
anybody if you want to talk some more.
yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Bye.